Welcome to the Teachers Talkin' podcast, hosted by Dustin Tatro and Ghazali Abdul Wahab. In this podcast, we discuss all things education and teaching, from innovative teaching methods to challenges to strategies and much, much more. In this discussion or roundtable-based podcast, we bring in educators from all around the world to talk about a variety of education topics so that we can support as many teachers as possible. We want this to be a place of inspiration, personal and professional development, and simply a place where we can elevate education together. Welcome to Teachers Talkin'. Okay, welcome to episode 9 of Teachers Talkin', everybody. In this episode titled Amplifying Student Voices, Strategies for Empowerment in Education, I am Dustin. As always, I am here with my co-host Ghazali, and we are just thrilled to have our guest Cecilia Alcaraz with us today, where we are going to focus on the question. We're going to focus on the question, how can educators empower students and involve them in the decision-making process? So before we get started, Ceci, would you just tell us a little bit about yourself? What's your background in education? Where do you work? What do you do? Tell us about you.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Cecilia Alcaraz. Like Dustin just gave me an awesome introduction. I am an educator. I've been in education for 20 years. Currently, I am a dean of students over at the Noble Schools, and I've been a dean of students for about the past 10 years. Prior to that, I got my start off at an alternative school. So I was a guidance counselor there. Shout out to alternative schools who are doing the thing for students who don't fit into specific molds. And so I pretty much been in the realm of student services mostly, and have supported some classroom spaces.
And then just to clarify, she is based out of Chicago, Illinois.
Yeah.
For all of our worldwide listeners.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So I've been in Chicago the entire time. So my educational career is based in Chicago. That's where my experience is at. And so that's pretty much where I've been this entire time.
That's awesome. So our topic today is on understanding student voice and agency. And I hear from Dustin, that's your area of specialty. You know quite a lot about this. So maybe to get you started, how do you define student voice and agency, and why are they important in education today?
Yep. So what deans of students really do, they really support the culture and spaces. And in order for you to have culture and buy-in, you have to have student voice. Student voice is basically, in my opinion, it's like feedback. You're asking kids, what is it they want to do? How do they want their school community to look like? And what are some of the goals they might want to set for themselves? And agency for me is pretty much just creating our students to become action orientated, becoming responsible for things that are happening in their school, ownership of it, rather than just providing the feedback, which is what student voice is. When I think about agency and why is it important for our students, it's that our students have a lot of information at their fingertips, which is very different from when I grew up. We were out there seeking the information, and nowadays it's right at your fingertips. And so what I find is what do students do with that information, right? How do they create action, and how do they then get a sense of responsibility to become independent thinkers for themselves? And what are you going to do with the information to make changes in themselves, in the community, in the city, in the world? What's the action step behind it? And so that's what student voice and agency means to me, and how it shows up in student and school culture is you can have students come together and create norms, what our community is to look like. But then how do you then take those norms and instill them into our students to take it into their community and live through whatever values that we decided on?
Oh, that's very interesting. I would like to know more about how do you create that school culture? How do you get teachers on board to change the way that they teach? From the traditional method where it's very teacher-centered, to one where the teachers promote student voice and agency? How do you create that buy-in with your teachers in your school?
Yeah, usually it often starts off at the beginning of the school year, where like everybody's getting to know each other. And then, so I think it's important when you aren't teaching to like find the balance of mastering content and skills and also including student voice, right? We had a mutual principal, Dustin and I, Miss Jennifer Reed, and she used to always say, like, we're a schoolhouse first and foremost. Like, we're a schoolhouse, we're a schoolhouse, we're a schoolhouse. And so that's something that I really like believe in. So I think the first thing is just to make sure you have strong teachers who are open to student feedback. If a teacher is not a very strong teacher, they then tend to like shy away from hearing student voice because they might take that as an attack rather than like just giving them feedback. And so like starting off with summer professional development and ensuring that that is a through line and that is something that the school values, the student voice. Once the school says like this is what we're valuing, I think it's easier to create buy-in from teachers. And then in the first few weeks, like you just talk about like what are some, at the end of the week you can give like exit tickets where you're like asking for specific feedback. You can also do like Google forms and surveys of that nature to like kind of gather like how has the first few days of school been, how like what do you like about the setup of my classroom, or what are some things that I can do better to service you. I think student voice is relatively, for I find, easier to gather than like creating student agency, because student agency then requires like an action step from our students. And what I've seen the post-pandemic is that our students are used to being fed information and not necessarily taking some things into action. So I think like that's where we need to be like working towards. Again, this is a generalization. There's pockets of like great students doing great things in every single space, but I think like overall, just being very direct and gathering that feedback. Like, what is the mode that you're most comfortable with, right? Some folks don't like Google Forms, and I can understand that. And so just keeping like, you know, a little exit ticket, a little slip, like leaving notes. What did I do well? What can I do better? And even like, how do you want to get redirected, right? If I'm talking to my friend and the teacher says, Cecilia, stop talking, like that, I may feel attacked, or is there a different way that I want to be redirected? Is I think really important. I think the other way, which is more of a formal way to do it, is you know, student council, right? What kind of groups and organizations do you have on your campus? Student council is a very easy one. Something that I've done is usually student council, like people run for the positions and they vote and they kind of, it's a little bit more formal, democratic type of process. I run it more as in like a student representative. So every single space has to have a student representative. Every like homeroom or division, for us it's advisories, they have to have a student representative. And whenever we run through some like school events or some school policies, we run it through them. And they then give us like the feedback, and they're pretty open about it. And then they take that information back to their respective classrooms and share that information out. I think that's a really easy way, low lift, to get student voice. And then also doing like an annual pre and post survey, which we often do right now. CPS is using Cultivate. It's a survey that asks students like how they feel in spaces, classrooms, and their school community. And that's more of a formal way to get student voice. And then we dig into that data, like how do our students feel? What are some areas that we can improve on? And we focus on those 2-3 areas for the rest of the school year. And then give a post follow-up survey at the end just to see like if we've grown in those areas.
Thank you so much. Your answers are so super detailed, and like you're answering like all the questions that we've already come up with, which is crazy and incredible. So I'm curious, you've given us a lot of different ways that you can involve students, whether it's through feedback or through agency. What would you say, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but what would you say are some common challenges that educators and school leaders face when they're trying to promote student voice and agency, and how can they collaboratively overcome those obstacles?
Yeah, I think some of the roadblocks that people fall into is assuming that because they are young people, they don't know much. Like I'm the expert, I know, or also like in the sense, like I've been in education for 20 years. So sometimes when kids push back and I'm like, oh, because you've been doing it for so long, I think the administration or the people who are receiving this feedback need to be really open to the feedback and also understand that it might, shake up the status quo, and you have to be okay with that, right? And so oftentimes I hear educators, parents say, we need to get our students ready for the real world. And I'm like, man, this real world is not a good world, right? So like, how do you balance getting our kids prepared for the real world, but also creating agency within them so that they're able to shake up the real world, because the real world is not all that it's cracked up to be. And so I think a couple of things is like being open and comfortable with being uncomfortable with some of that feedback. Also being very transparent with students that some feedback might not happen right now. And if it does not happen right now, what are the plans to kind of get that going? Because our kids are very like, they need the things now, like instant gratification. And if you don't take their feedback instantly, then they tend to shy away from giving the feedback later. And so it's like, hey, being very clear with them about what can and cannot be changed, and then what is the process to change it long term. So I think those are some things that administrators can really get uncomfortable doing, is just being able to be open to some of the feedback that our students have, because we're so stuck in the way that we do things, right? For example, we had some students asking for very specific classes. And as a person who does like scheduling, I'm like, there's no way, like we can't do that, or whatever it may be. But I think that I already went into that conversation knowing that it was not going to be possible, rather than trying to figure out how to make it possible. And so I think that's like one of the biggest challenges that, adults face working in schools, is being able to like shake it up rather than continue to do the plug and play.
Ghazali, are you with us? You looked frozen for a second there. Ceci, there's so many great things there. And really bringing how to bring students in, the transparency with them, I think is really crucial. And partnering with parents. What other ways, when you talk about like those leaders needing to be open to that feedback, how do we start to build that within them? Like, what do we need to do to collaborate with leaders to like get them to be more open? Because it feels like even post-pandemic in so many places, people just went back to business as usual, which was a lack of student voice, a lack of student agency, a lack of collaboration. Like, this worked before, it's going to work again. So how do we bridge that so that we can get these leaders who have been doing things for a very long time? Because as we know, most schools, these leaders have just been there. They haven't gone anywhere. Right. And so like, how do we start to open their minds and like collaborate with them to be more open?
I think there's a couple of like methods. One of them in particular is getting back to like our core values, right? Like, what does the school stand for, and what are they trying to provide for our students, right? I think those two things, oftentimes a lot of people revisit core values over summer, and then they kind of sit on a sheet, in a Google Doc, on a bookshelf somewhere, a poster, and they just don't revisit them throughout the school year. And I think being very core value aligned allows us to have those conversations where somebody on the table is seeing that an administrator, a teacher is still very much like stuck in their ways. I would say like one of them is just being able to call it out and saying, being very transparent, like, hey, Cecilia, like, I feel like you're not, leading through your mission and your core values in this moment. And so I really want you to be open, because what actually the best idea wins, and not the most comfortable idea wins. So I think like being very transparent and calling people out when their core values are not aligned, revisiting core values, if transparency and also like, innovation is one of those core values. I think that's really important. And then on the other end, like, I always like love to read a good book, right? And so there's tons of good books out there. One of them, I think that we actually read together, Dustin, was the 5 Dysfunctions of leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And so that one was a really great one to be able to like have this conversation. They like you see yourself in every single one of those characters, and how you do some self-reflection on like, is this core value online? Is this something that I'm doing? And then on the like the very last piece, I think always leading with this idea, like what would the best school do? What would the best school do? The best, like, oftentimes we find ourselves so stuck in our ways that we're like not even seeing, well, since we're doing better than our, you know, than some other counterparts, but are we doing our very best? Because our kids deserve the very best. So like making sure we're aligned with core values, calling out people who are not core value aligned, where we're trying to figure out a solution to a problem, or when we're trying to take student feedback. And then also just making sure that we're having professional development around it, I think is really important in order for us to start like breaking away from the true and tried. And we know it has not been true and tried, because like given the state of education, it's definitely not true and tried.
Mm-hmm. So to link to that idea, of what you've done, what you've tested with the students, how can school leaders continuously assess and evaluate the effectiveness of their efforts to foster a culture of student participation, and then make necessary adjustments based on the feedback from the students, teachers, and even other stakeholders?
I think the most important part is to make sure that it is like a cadence. Like there has to be a cadence. It has to be planned out. If you don't plan for it, it won't happen. So over the summer, I know that I pick out very specific times of the year when I'm going to gather feedback. I know that we push our teachers to gather feedback from students at the end of every unit, like what went well in that unit, what were some activities you did like to do, what were some activities that you did not like to do. And so I think being very thoughtful and planned out is the most important way for you to make sure that you get feedback from students. Because if you don't plan it out, then the whirlwind of the school year happens, things pop up and the school year, the train's on the tracks and you forget where you are actually trying to go because you're just so used to being on the go. So making sure that we're planning out. And once you plan out and like deliver whatever the mechanism is to gather student feedback and voice, sharing those with our students, I think is most important. I always share back like what they said, what are the areas that we're going to focus on for the next 2 months. And then when you give a post survey, you can share again with students like, hey, we grew, we did not grow. Here are some of the steps that we're going to do to get there. And then if you have any feedback, obviously give us some feedback on the steps. Usually with the feedback that we're going to implement, we run it through our student council to say like, hey, is this something that you think that your fellow peers would be into? And then they will either go back to their advisory group and share it, or just kind of give their feedback in that moment. But the number one way that schools can get feedback from students is by just planning it out, like literally planning it out. We give a beginning, a middle, and an end of the year survey for our students. And we've gotten some really good feedback from that. And we've implemented and shared results with kids. I think it's really great too.
A couple of times you've mentioned student council, which I can tell is really important to you and in your school. So I'm curious, because you've talked a little bit about the ways that you've used student council. Can you tell us, does your student council, are they involved in helping make big decisions at the school level? And if so, like, how do you get them involved in making those? I was thinking back to a couple of schools where I worked at, one of which when we were together, and prior to that, where we created like the principals cabinet, where students actually, like the student reps actually met with our leadership team and asked them pointed questions and asked them about, why did you make this decision, that decision? Can we do this sort of thing, that sort of thing? And then took that back to the classes to report back. Is that kind of what your student council is doing? Or like, in what ways is your student council involved in like making real decisions that impact the full school community?
So in full transparency, they make decisions based upon like more of culture, not of policy. Right. So like what is our space going to look like? What is our space going to feel like? But something that I am pushing for this year, I just transitioned to this school. So I'm relatively new. I'm just finishing up my second year. So, there is that new feel of creating buy-in and importance within your leadership team that I'm still like working on. At DRW, I was there for like 10 years. So like I was a little bit more like seasoned. And so people trust me a lot more. I'm still building that up right now. But what I am pushing for this year, I call it student council, but I don't think it's student council. I think it's more like House of Representatives, right? Because they don't vote, and we get somebody from each classroom to like represent their space. So I'm gonna start using House of Reps actually. But what we actually do is every year they review the parent student handbook. And so that's where I'm really thinking about how can I leverage our group of students right now to give tough feedback to the policies that are given to us in the beginning of the school year. So right now we're like preparing some of our some of our arguments, getting our kids getting ready, giving them the practice of creating agency for themselves. And so that's kind of like where we're at right now. But I do think oftentimes the policy is already made. And so I don't like to falsely tell our kids like what are your thoughts on it, because I won't be able to like do anything about it. But I do share like, hey, you can always share with me, but like this is what it is. And I often compare it to like a red light camera. I'm like, man, I was going 31 and a 30 and I got a ticket, right? I don't like it, but that is a policy. And so I also have to learn how to drive at a 30 in a 30 zone with a camera a speeding ticket. So I think those are some of the things that I think about. And I don't think that we're at the space right now in society to really listen to our students. I hear about student walkouts all the time. And I'm like, what happened that we didn't hear them out? And oftentimes, if we do hear them out, like, are we really ready to make a change for them? I don't know if administrations across, the country are willing to do that quite yet, I don't know if you remember, Dustin, like I was always trying to get everybody to build a co-op school. Remember, like, let's do a co-op, right? And so I think it's really important that every stakeholder really has a say in their space and in their culture and their community. But right now, schools are very, hierarchical, right? Like top to bottom, you have to do what you have to do. It's our jobs, and I get it. But I always have like dreamed of building a co-op school where like everybody has a say, and like we have a student rep at the administration table, and there is no principal. We're just all doing our jobs really well, and we come together to make decisions rather than it being always top down.
Yeah, I love that. Can you tell us a little bit too about, we're talking so much about school level, which was kind of like the point of this conversation, but I'm also just curious, since you are working with kids who are not really involved, where they're more involved in culture than they are policy, how are you also leveraging that type of thing to help build that student voice and agency within classrooms themselves? Like, what kind of work do you do, even from your role specifically working with students? What kind of work do you do with teachers to also sort of like fold these things in so that you're building things really from the ground up to sort of break that tier down, right?
So to be quite honestly, right now we are back to the basics at my school in particular. And so we're really focusing on classroom and like teaching and learning. I don't know if we are quite there yet, just because of all the learning loss over a pandemic. So we're not quite there yet as far as like it not being top down, because what we do know is that we have best practices. And so how do we focus on those best practices for our teachers? And once those best practices are completed, then I think that's where you start to move along the way, in the sense of like a first year teacher, right? They're like overwhelmed with curriculum planning or whatever else it may be. So I believe in having a strong foundation first of like good teaching practices. And then once you're there, it's like the locus of control, right? You can take care of yourself, and then how do you move out? What I often find is not our strongest teachers. They tend to take student voice and student agency, and like that's all that they run with, or they're trying to implement that, but they still haven't gotten the basics down, right? And so right now we're just really focused on back to the basics. But what's really cool about this one survey that we're doing for CPS, like Cultivate, they pick one classroom to give feedback on. And it's like really interesting to see some of the things that came out of that survey, things that I thought, something that I felt, but I didn't know for certain. One of them was like the questions asked, like, does this teacher care about me? Can I trust this teacher? Things of that nature. And they were all strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly agree. One of our lowest scores was, my teacher believes I can do hard things. I thought, wow. So they feel comfortable. Our kids feel comfortable. They know we care about them. They know they have a sense of belonging. But are we pushing rigor with our kids? And we're not, right? Because we're so also we've been instilled with all the learning loss, which is true, right? But also then are we like lowering the bar? Are we lowering the rigor? And our kids are feeling that. So I think that has been something that has really stood out. And so through this survey, and I think other school districts have other surveys. I know like now across the nation, they're starting to implement surveys just to kind of get an extra set of data. I'm not sure what other schools are doing with it, but I know that we're using that data to really have conversations with our teachers and saying, hey, this is what our kids said about your space. What are the action steps that you can put into play in order for you to like make this school culture stronger? And so just reviewing their data with them, I think is like that's a good first step. And just thinking about how can we make the cadence of that a little bit more, because we only do it twice a year.
That's very interesting approach.
That's definitely an area of growth for us. I think like across this country, is just making sure we're like folding in student feedback a lot more.
All right. So for this for feedback, right, from students, I'm getting a lot of responses from teachers. The reason why they are a bit hesitant about allowing student feedback to really thrive a lot in the classroom is it's also because of this recent advent of AI, ChatGPT and stuff. So I was wondering, how does your school or yourself mitigate this issue? Like when you give the student agency, how do you know what you get is actually from the students themselves? Or how do you know that what the students are giving you is not something that they have, used AI to come up with to give the teachers, especially in the realm of like homework and stuff? So how do you mitigate this?
Yeah, I think so to understand the question correctly, how do we know that student agency is original within like the field of AI?
Authentic feedback, in other words, yeah.
Yeah. Like your students, right? And like the language that they use, the words that they use. If I were to receive some feedback that didn't sound like the person who's giving the feedback, I'm like, this is funny. I think the most important thing is to know your kids, right? And you have to really get to know your students in a way that like you can remove names from the feedback and you know exactly who left you that feedback, right? Building those relationships with students will, if you have a relationship built really strongly with a student, they want to let you know how they're doing. They're not looking to go out of the way to fake feedback. They want to tell you what you're doing really great and what you need to work on because they care about you and they know that there's a relationship established. Feedback is easier to give once there's a relationship established. And so I think once you establish that student-teacher relationship and it is a solid relationship, kids will come to you and they will tell you things you don't even want to know. Like, I don't want to know. I don't want to know who you're dating. I don't want to know, right? And so I think those are some things in the beginning of the school year, particularly like building that relationship. And even as it gets like harmed along the way, as long as you continue to like double back on it and ensure that you're following up with students so that they know that the relationship that you have with them is genuine and then they genuinely want to give you feedback.
I think that's a really good answer. It's very key these days, TSR, teacher-student relationship. What are some things that you do with your class or that you promote with your teachers? How do you strengthen this bond in the classroom?
Yeah, so we, the beginning of the year spent a lot of time like getting to know each other and always like get to know you or whatnot. But if a student is having like a particular situation, oftentimes there's two very specific ways that we do it. One of them is like through a restorative conversation. So if you feel like you and some teacher maybe have bumped heads or maybe there was a misunderstanding of some sort, our students are able to fill out a form and say, hey, I want to meet with this teacher. And then they have like a student advocate with them. And then we have like the teacher's manager with them. And then they just have a conversation about like whatever it was that has transpired that they feel, some type of way about. And then the other way is that we really want to fold in our teachers and they're all asked to hold one after school club. And so they're able to immerse themselves into our school culture. I mean, we give them a small stipend for it, but every teacher then holds a club that they're into. And then you can just genuinely see teachers and students like building relationships. Like we have a skateboard club right now where like our students love skateboarding. And I was like, I didn't even know that kids skateboard, right? So now you start to share things about other, like, oh, or we share pictures, right? We have a bright spot every morning. And in that bright spot, it's like just really cool things happening in our school. And then it also gives us the same conversation piece, right? So last week, one of our bright spots was we have a senior who won like Boys and Girl Club Youth of the City. And I didn't even know she was in the Boys and Girls Club. It was through this like bright spot that I was able to like talk to her about it. Like, I didn't know that. Tell me about this. Tell me about that. So we're able to have those conversations through these bright spots from other adults. And then the after school club, that's a really cool one. And then the restorative conversations that we have with some of our students and teachers, it helps repair relationships if they get harmed.
You know,
that's really amazing. Yeah. Dustin, you have a question?
No, a comment. I just appreciate bringing this to the idea of relationships, because the other thing that is in my head here is, you know, we're talking right now a little bit about like relationships between students and teachers and feeling comfortable with your teacher to be able to like give that feedback and stuff. But then going back to the beginning of this conversation where we were talking about how students can help to build positive culture in the school, like students also need to have a relationship with their school, right? Like within adults in the school who are not just their teachers, if they're going to give that high quality feedback for the school itself, right? And so this idea of like relationships, it goes all the way around. It's not just specific to the teacher, but it's really about like what's your relationship with your school as a whole, and are you comfortable within your school? And if you are, you're going to be more willing to give that feedback, more willing to give your voice, more willing to push towards agency than if you don't really care about your school, if you hate going to school or whatever, right?
Yeah, I think that's, and then when you talk about like when kids hate going to school, like that's big, right? That's where it affects like attendance. That's where it affects like learning, you know, that's where students are more likely to drop out. And it's like this ever evolving problem that could have just been solved by creating a sense of belonging for our students. And the other thing that I will say is that also like we're very privileged to be in Chicago where it's a choice. And so if your student is, you know, if your child, you know, your student child is like not comfortable at a school, like we have choices, right? You can find another school until you actually find the school that's going to meet your students' needs. Which I think is the most important.
Yeah, exactly. So that's something that is very dramatic in the sense that you give the students options. Yeah, and I like the way of this. You mentioned about the restorative process, so they actually get to fill out a form, and then they can bring up a student advocate. Is that just like a lawyer or something that speaks on their behalf?
No.
Wow. Okay.
No. So it's like, you know, in relationships, sometimes something may occur that the other person perceived it as something that wasn't appropriate, right? Or something that may have hurt their feelings or may have damaged your relationship or made them feel some type of way. And so when those things happen, I think it's also really important to like teach our children on how to just maneuver difficult conversations. And oftentimes kids don't know how to do that with adults because there's a power dynamic. And so then the only way for you to teach students that is to practice it. And so sometimes if, you know, some teacher may have said something to you in the sense of like, pick your head up or whatever it may be, or why don't you bring your pencil, or where's your homework, whatever it may be, the student may receive that communication as negative, and then they now may think, you know, me and this teacher are no longer have a good relationship, when in reality it was just one incident that may have not felt too great. And so like, how do you repair that part of the relationship? Because in relationships, no matter what the relationships, incidents are going to occur where the repair needs to happen. And so like, how do we teach our students that so then they can create that agency for themselves and take that life skill on with themselves in college, in relationships, in, friendships and parent relationships, any kind of relationship. There's going to be a moment in time where we may not align and we need to repair it.
Yeah, that's certainly right. Is there anything else you'd like to share or discuss regarding the promotion of student voice and agency that we may not have covered? Anything else you can add?
I think I pretty much said it all. I just think the one thing I want to stamp is, in order to create a safe space for students to give their voice, you have to ensure that you are actually listening to the voice and not just gathering it for the sake of checking off a box. No matter how uncomfortable it may feel, or some of the things that they may say may make you feel uncomfortable, I think people need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
That's such a great way to conclude the episode here too, because I think you're nailing it. And even thinking about like these restorative conversations, like there's impact, there's intent, there's impact, and then there's response and restoration, right? And that goes for everybody. That's whether that's an issue between adults or an issue between kids or an issue between kids and adults, right? And then also just that idea of leaders having this quote unquote open door policy. It's not really an open door if all you're doing is listening and you're not really hearing and taking that feedback. So getting comfortable with being uncomfortable is such a perfect way to sort of conclude all this idea of bringing students' voice and agency into our schools to help build our culture and make those decisions. So thank you so much, Ceci, for being with us today and just bringing so much enlightening information. It was really wonderful to get to chat with you. Ghazali, do you have any closing words for us?
Well, I think I've learned so much today. Definitely, I will be using more of this in my classroom, giving my students more voice, agency, feedback, taking it in. Yeah, it's scary. You're right. It's pretty scary sometimes because sometimes you do not know how to handle negative feedback. and so you got to reframe the question and see how to turn it into something more positive, constructive. Yeah, I'll have to think more about that.
Or sometimes,
and I also think
no, go ahead.
I also think that sometimes some people give when you receive feedback, you wear it like that's who you are, right? And it's like that's not who you are. That was a moment in time. Feedback is for a moment in time, an interaction between two people. That is not who you are. We don't always show up as our best selves. And so just being very vulnerable of saying like, hey, that was not my best self. Like that's not who I am. And then putting into play to really show who you are is really important.
Yeah, that's great. That's exactly what I was thinking about. How do I reframe something, from being negative to being more positive or neutral? So I think, yeah, that's a very good advice. It's just feedback at a point in time, and it's not the person that you are, and it's also to help you become better in your craft. Yeah, so I think that's very good advice.
Yeah, and I think too, to go along with that, sometimes recognizing when, and even teaching this to our students, right? When you're getting feedback in a moment, but it's not a right moment for you, when emotions are high or whatever, it's difficult to accept feedback, period. So recognizing that, but also not shying away from going back to get that feedback. And then secondarily, what do you do with it? Right? Like so often when people talk about like feedback is really important, but if nothing's happening with that feedback, then the feedback's non-existent, right? So also teaching our students how not only to listen and accept feedback, but then what to do with feedback.
Right. And that's the agency part. That's where you're creating the agency, and that's where you're creating the action in it, right? And the only way for you to like really get good at that skill is by practicing it. And the only way for you to practice is by you planning out when to give that feedback, right? So it's like always being really thoughtful and when you're going to get it, how you're going to get it, and then what you're going to do with it, and how you're going to relay that back to the person you got it from.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much. This is the end of our episode. So we will be back with our next episode on March 25th. So again, Ceci, thank you. Ghazali, as always, it's been a pleasure. Talk to everybody later. Don't forget to subscribe
Bye.
and
Dusty.
share.
Gracie, I sure will.